Now, this morning, I could speak about the inspiring story about how the early church experimented with alternative forms of intentional living, where they shared everything they had in common. That might have been an inspiring sermon. Or I could have spoken about Psalm 23, everyone's most beloved psalm, which promises us God's gentle guidance, regardless of whether we walk through green pastures or through the valley of the shadow of death. That too might have been an inspiring sermon. Finally, I could have spoken about Christ as the Good Shepherd, the one who knows each of us by name and gives us life and life in fullness. That also might have been an inspiring sermon. But I'm a sucker for suffering, and so I am going to go to 1 Peter instead. So just a little background about 1 Peter. There's a scholarly debate, which I won't get into, about whether Peter actually wrote this or not. It's not important for today's sermon, but I just want to know when I use the name Peter, I'm talking about the author of the letter, whoever it was. I'm not actually saying it was Peter. I'm not saying it's not. I'm Switzerland there for now. At least for the purpose of this sermon. Not Switzerland, we can talk afterwards if you want. So Peter tells us that if we suffer, we win God's approval. If we suffer for doing well, for doing good. Now, of course, this kind of advice works better in some situations than in other situations. For example, if you're a battered wife, knowing that your suffering wins God's approval might be great and everything, but it might not be quite as helpful as knowing how to remove yourself from that destructive situation. And of course, Peter's not saying that we should seek out suffering. He's saying, rather, that we should occupy ourselves with doing well regardless of the outcome. That's really what I think he's trying to say. Now, when we try to understand Scripture, context is key. But the lectionary, the determined readings that we are given, go through a 3-year cycle. The lectionary has today cleverly concealed from us what this passage is actually about. It's, I think, trying to protect us, because it's troubling. What this passage is actually about is actually kind of more troubling than it already might be. Verse 18, which is omitted and finds no home anywhere in the lectionary within 3 years, it tells us what Peter is actually speaking about. But because we didn't hear it this morning, there's a good chance that we just don't know. So what is it? In verse 18, Peter says, "Slaves, accept the authority of your master with all deference, not only to those who are kind and gentle, but also to those who are harsh." And then it goes on with the reading that we heard. "For it is a credit to you if you suffer unjustly." So it's what he's really talking about. He's not talking about suffering of everyone, of the human race, just general suffering. He's talking about the suffering experienced by slaves at his time. So basically, Peter's telling us that even if you have a cruel master, you should treat that master with respect. And this might sound like horrible news to us. Walter Wink, an important thinker, once wrote that 150 years ago, it might be a little bit more now, but regardless, the debate over slavery was raging, and the Bible seemed to be clearly on the slaveholder's side. Now, it also needs to be mentioned that those resisting slavery, the abolitionists, they also used the Bible. So it's not as one-sided as the Wink quote might suggest. But that being said, the abolitionists would be facing an uphill battle when someone brought out 1 Peter 2:18. That would be a little bit tough. So what are we to do with this? First of all, it's interesting that unlike Colossians and first in the pastorals, unlike those things, Peter does not speak to the masters here. He only speaks to slaves. And there's a couple reasons why this might be. He might just imagine that there are no masters in the communities to whom he is writing. This could be simply economic. The people in his communities are too poor to be able to afford slaves. Or it could be just that he couldn't imagine a Christ follower owning another person. He doesn't say, so that's it's an unanswerable question ultimately. But I think it's interesting. So let's go a little deeper into the question of context and see what's going on here in this letter. So early Christianity, as I think we all know, but sometimes the difference in context is missed by us, was a fringe movement in the early days. It did not have any political clout at this time like it did later. And in the Roman Empire, if you wish to engage in the kind of protest that we kind of take for granted, that we assume we have the right to do, rightfully so, you would likely find yourself crucified. The Roman Empire had little tolerance for pushback. Now, this is not to say that Peter could have done more or said more. It's just to try and frame the issue in a way that might be a little bit more fair to him and his ancient context. Also, just to remember the situation, being a slave is not like having a job. And so having a harsh master is not like having a harsh boss. And if you have a harsh boss, you can quit. There is no provision for that. You can buy your freedom, but you can't just quit slavery. There's no freedom in that respect. So some of the parallels that we might want to plunk it into in our modern day don't really sit very well. So Peter's really trying to reinterpret for his audience unavoidable suffering because they're slaves suffering under the hand of unjust masters. He's trying to bring it into some sort of redemptive. It's not just suffering that means nothing. It's suffering because now you're following in the footsteps of Jesus, who also suffered. And while it would have been immensely helpful in the 17th and 18th centuries if Peter had come down squarely against slavery as an institution, in the situation of his immediate listeners, it wouldn't have changed anything, really. Peter, I suspect, wanted good for these slaves, but he was not really in a position to make bad masters good masters. And he was also not in a position to eliminate slavery altogether. So we might not think that that's enough. I'm not really trying to let Peter off the hook. I just want to put him in his context. All this being said, there is, and this is where it gets interesting in my mind, there is a subversive note against slavery that's hidden, and it's hidden so well, I don't think the original recipients would have missed it, but we probably do because we live in a different time and context. So let me see if I can flesh this out a bit. The ancient world, as we all suspect and all know, was very deeply patriarchal. That is, it was very centered around the father of the household. The father of the household was the one who determined what everybody's life would be like in the household. And this is included, of course, his children, the whole extended family, and, of course, his slaves. And one thing this meant was, if the father of the household worshipped Zeus, everybody in the household would worship Zeus. So the religion of the whole household was determined by the father of the household. Now, this letter clearly assumes that the followers of Jesus will keep faith with Jesus, that they will not go out and start worshiping Zeus. It clearly assumes that. And this would have been against everything that was assumed in the ancient world, right? So there's a quiet assumption that's not even really stated, but it's implicitly very, very firmly in the letter. So, and it's very likely that one of the reasons why some of these slaves were having a hard time is because they refused to give up Jesus. They refused to give up their form of worship. They refused to go along with what the masters. Again, this would have been a cultural, you just didn't do that. And their unwillingness to give up their faith in their God would have marked them as troublemakers and would have marked them also for beatings from their master on a regular basis. So if you look at his advice in that light, it seems like the slaves are almost approaching something like what we might see with Martin Luther King and his nonviolence. There's a quiet revolution going on. It's not an overt revolution, it's a quiet revolution. But it's a revolution that affirmed the autonomy, at least in this one area of life. They might not have been able to make decisions for themselves in many areas, but the slaves retained the ability in this one central area of their identity and their personhood. They were going to make that decision. No master was going to make that for them. And that small was very subversive and very troubling in the ancient world. One of the reasons why Christians weren't liked very much in the ancient world. They preserved for themselves the right to make this one key decision. And I think Peter was trying to support them. He was trying to do what he could, and sometimes doing what you can is less than doing what you want. I think we face this every day. We would like to see massive change on the environment, but we can recycle better. There's some things we can do. We can't individually go out and just make this massive change. We might seek it, but every day we have to make these compromises with ourselves and do what we can. And sometimes it's frustrating because we would like to do what we want, but that's just not there for us. So sometimes doing what you can means that you have to accept some of the ills, some of the evils of the world, even while you're trying to push back a bit. And it's the complicated life that we live in this society. We're doing that, I think we're doing that all the time. Just about every time we buy clothing, right? Every time we buy food, every time we buy gasoline, every time we're hopefully trying to push back, but we're also complicit a little bit. So we're in a very complicated and difficult context. And of course, because we live in unjust systems that we live in make it impossible to really do the fully good thing. You just can't do it. It's not there for you to do. So we seek to find these small ways to push back and make life just a little bit better and a little bit more just. And Peter reminds us that sometimes, even if we cannot see a way to fix a problem right there, there still might be a way to affirm human dignity and respect. There's still something we can do. Is this enough? Should Peter have gone farther? Well, what do you think? Amen.